You know who I miss? I miss David Letterman. In the spirit of David Letterman, let me share with you the top 10 ways you know you're in a bad church. Number 10, the church bus has gun racks. Number 9, the church staff consists of senior pastor, associate pastor, and socio-pastor. Number 8, the Bible they use is the Dr. Seuss version. Number 7, there's an ATM in the lobby. Number 6, and I hope this one happens at some point, choir wears leather robes. Number 5, this reminds me of Kentucky. Worship services are BYOS, bring your own snakes. Number 4, you know you're in a bad church when it says, no cover charge, but communion is a 2-drink minimum. Number 3, karaoke worship time. We should try that. Number 2, ushers ask, smoking or non-smoking? And the number 1 way that we know we're in a bad church, the only song the organist knows is In-A-Gadda-Da-Vida. You know, David Letterman's sidekick was named Paul, so you'll know. Okay, so that's a bad church. What's a good church? A good church is one that helps people connect with the experience of a holy and sacred God. And the question is, do we do that for people? Do we experience God, the holy, the sacred, in worship here at Immanual? Of course, what do we mean by worship when we use that word? Worship is a very old Anglo-Saxon word that refers to a condition of being worthy. So you're worshipped if you're worthy. It refers to people who are have dignity, glory, distinction, honor, renown. And so at first, the word worship was used in reference to people who were worthy to be worshipped, such as kings or judges. And then around the year 1300, we see the word used almost exclusively in a religious sense. Worship became reverence paid to a supernatural or divine being rather than people. And so today, rarely do we say we worship another human being because it really sounds sort of ridiculous to us. But in the ancient world, they did use that word in reference to people. But today, when we talk about worship, we're talking about God, who is the subject of our worship. Now, we didn't read the psalm reading today, which there's always on our calendar a reading from the book of Psalms. The one today is Psalm 86, and I want to share with you verse 10. Here the psalmist worships God by saying, and just very directly, God, you're the one. There's no one but you. Those are words of worship. And the psalmist here is engaging in the purest form of worship in his tradition and in our tradition, which is the worship of the one true God. And we Christians have inherited this tradition of monotheism, which is the worship of one God, although we do employ Trinitarian language, which does muddy the waters just a little bit in the minds of people who are trying to understand what we understand about God. Nevertheless, we are monotheistic. We believe in one God. So how do we worship this one true God? How do we connect with and experience the holy and the sacred in worship? Do we use emotion? That is, do we tug people's emotional strings and then claim this is a true worship experience? I have to admit, personally, that that I cringe just a little bit when someone tells me that they have experienced God in worship. And when I ask them, how did they know that? What was the sign of that experience? And they said that they had an emotional experience. And sometimes I cynically ask myself, so crying equals an experience with God? To me, that sounds a little manipulative and perhaps a little shallow. Not that there's anything wrong with crying in church. Let me be clear about that. Crying may not be allowed in baseball, to quote the great Tom Hanks, but it is allowed in worship. You can cry in church. It's allowed. And yet worship, to me, needs to be more than just a teary eye or two. So I thought about this. I thought, well, maybe worship is a lot like fishing. I used to fish quite a bit. When I was a youngster, I was pretty much a river rat. And I remember the experience quite well. Some of you who fish can relate to this. I could sit in a boat all day long with nary a nibble, and then all of a sudden, a large, beautiful bass would come along and would snag my lure. And even if the bass got away, I had this momentary experience of something that is almost indescribable. In my opinion, there are few experiences in life that are as thrilling as a fish biting your hook or nabbing your lure. Now, it's not thrilling for the fish, of course, but it is for the fisher person. I think that's sort of like what worship is. It is an event of waiting, an event of waiting. And just as we are unable to manipulate a fish to take the bait, we can't say, hey, fish, here's the bait, take it. We are also unable to manipulate people through emotion or anything else to have a true worship experience. We can't just snap our fingers and say, you're going to have a true worship experience now. No, it's a matter of waiting. But how do we wait? What does that look like? We wait with a sense of openness and attentiveness and expectation for a sense of the sacred to come splashing into our world. That's how it happens. And yet, let's be clear about something else. We can't do that. We can't sit and wait and be open and expecting, right, something to happen, something to come splashing into our world if the water is frozen. Even the fisherman who fishes on a frozen lake or pond understands that to get to the fish, you have to cut a hole in the ice and get underneath the ice. You can't fish on something that's frozen. You have to cut through it. So that's what we have to do to have a true worship experience. Now, what I mean by the word frozen is that sometimes we worshipers, we wait, we're patient, we're waiting, but we wait with no openness. And we wait without being attentive. We're just waiting. And sometimes we wait with no expectations whatsoever for a sense of the sacred to come splashing into our world. Have you ever heard the term, the Frozen Chosin? The Frozen Chosin? Oftentimes you hear it in reference to Presbyterians, but it really applies to all of us. It's a phrase that is used to refer to all of folks in mainline Protestant denominations and congregations such as our own. What we need, people say, because we are somewhat frozen, is a good thawing out. We need a good thawing out. And here's what I mean by that. For much of the history of American Protestantism, worship has primarily meant going to church to hear a good sermon. Now, obviously, that's still my favorite part of the worship service. But I'm slightly biased. But I would imagine for many of you, that's true as well, or the music, that there's something in particular that you really focus on when you come. And I understand the criticism, though, of just, thinking that we're only going to church to hear a good sermon. In our tradition, we focus more on a head first experience, right? That's the tradition. And so worship then becomes a reflection about God rather than an experience of God. Again, worship has become for us in our tradition a reflection about God rather than an experience of God. And in order to experience a true worship experience, somehow we need to spend at least part of this one sacred hour moving our focus about 18 inches from the head down to the heart. And I'm speaking metaphorically, of course. Now that doesn't mean we throw out the head stuff, because if we did that, you wouldn't need me, right? I would no longer have a job. It does mean, however, that we need to be able to move back and forth between the head and the heart. And what does that do? It creates spiritual blood flow, right? Physically, if you're not getting blood to the head because the heart's not working, you're not going to live. Spiritually, it's the same. Without blood flow from the heart to the head, back and forth, you're spiritually dead. And you know what all that blood flow will do then, don't you? If you have it, it will thaw us out. It will thaw us out. Thawing out is a metaphor for change and, more importantly, transformation. Just as ice thaws out and becomes water, our worship might need to thaw out a little bit and change into something a little more fluid. Now, that's kind of what the worship vitality people are telling us these days, that you got to be a little more fluid. How many of you have ever heard someone say here at Immanual about our worship, or maybe you said it yourself? That's the way we've always done it. Have you ever heard that? Those are the immortal words of the Frozen Chosin. Trust me. That's their slogan. Well, we need to be a little more fluid in our worship, whatever that might mean. And one reason that we need to be a little more fluid in our worship is because our churches are multi-generational. Multi-generational. How many of you knew the song that Paul played, the little riff, In-A-Gadda Vida? How many of you heard it? Some, not everybody. It was largely a generational thing, I think. And that's just an example. Our churches are multi-generational, and that's a problem. It's a good problem, but it is a problem that we have to try to figure out. Diana Butler Bass, who's a very popular Christian writer, says this about what I'm talking about. She says, "What proves meaningful, transcendent, and life-transforming to one generation may leave the next generation cold." Again, think of the Frozen Chosin image. She continues, "Although God may be the same, human beings experience God differently through time and history, opening up styles of worship and liturgy that vary wildly through the centuries. When any one form becomes codified, a kind of chilling effect sets in." A chilling effect. See the imagery? Now, although it's a little cooler today than what it normally is this time of the year, I still think thawing out is a really good metaphor or image for us to consider about ourselves, about our worship. Because frozen hearts cannot be transformed. Frozen hearts produce cold shoulders, which is what new people might experience if we are not open and attentive to God and worship. They might feel a little bit cold when they come in. Let me be clear about one more thing. In order for worship to be unfrozen, we don't necessarily have to choose between what we call what people in the worship wars refer to, which is traditional versus contemporary forms of worship. That's a false dichotomy, as they say. That's a false choice. We don't have to choose between that. We don't have to, for example, argue over what kind of music we're going to play or listen to in worship or sing with. For example, whether we use a piano, an organ, electric guitars, drums, or tambourines or whatever. that's not really the point. We're not talking about style or anything like that. What we're talking about is the willingness to be innovative and experimental and, most importantly, authentic, which really just means to be unfrozen. To be willing, to use the fishing imagery again, to be willing to cast our lures and patiently wait for the sacred to come splashing into our lives. And I don't know too many fisher persons who only have one lure in their tackle box. Do you? We have at our disposal every worship lure that has ever been imagined or practiced, and we are even free to create our own lure or lures. So, no matter how we worship, not important. There needs to be openness, right? Be open to an experience. There needs to be attentiveness to what's going on, pay attention. And most importantly, an expectation that God will make a big splash in our worship. So my final question to you is, are we wearing our spiritual wetsuits to church today? Amen.